for French in there? Yeah.
Now, I think we're live. Hello everybody, I hope you can see me out there in the wonderful world of the internet. Welcome to the Positive Now live streaming lecture. I'm just getting the technology going. It's new technology, so please bear with us. I just want to point out that there's a chat room underneath the video window there where you can ask questions or post your comments, and we'll be keeping an eye on them during the lecture and shout them out to Eddie. Hopefully he'll answer them for us. But without further ado, I will hand you over to Lysander Preston, who is the chairperson of Positive Now, to introduce our speaker of the night, Eddie. Thank you, Lysander.
Hi to everybody, and thank you very much for coming this evening, and thanks to Edward for agreeing to do the talk this evening. Edward originally trained as a registered nurse and practiced for a number of years. Thereafter, he has worked for the Irish Nurses and Midwives Organisation, where he is the Director of Regulation and Social Policy. He holds a first-class honours LLB in Irish Law from the Nottingham Trent University and a first-class LLM from Trinity College, Dublin. In addition, Edward holds a Barrister at Law degree and is a PhD candidate in Trinity College, Dublin. Edward's research focuses on whether it should be a criminal offence to transmit a disease during sexual intercourse, and if so, in what circumstances. Edward is also the director of GCD FLAC project, a lecturer in law in Griffith College, Dublin, a supervising lawyer with the Irish Innocence Project, and a director of the Talca River Drug Rehabilitation Project. And Eddie's here tonight to talk about the criminalisation of HIV transmission. Eddie, over to you, Edward.
Thanks very much, Lysander. It's always it's embarrassing or enlightening to read all the things you're supposed to be doing or have done. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with you. I should say, as a matter of apology, in the first instance, Lysander had very kindly invited me to speak at a conference, and I had made arrangements to travel to the conference, but as a result of flight difficulties, I didn't make it, and it's very impolite to do that, so I'm sorry, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak with you now. Look, I have to be conscious as well in the way that I present this, that I have a particular view about criminalisation, which some people will share and others won't, and it's always very difficult when delivering a talk about the criminalisation of the transmission of a disease. And for ease, I'm just going to talk about HIV. Could easily be hepatitis, could be multi-drug resistant gonorrhea or syphilis. All of those would fall within the definition of a serious sexually transmitted infection. But just for ease of purposes, we talk about HIV. It's always somewhat difficult in that there can be two perspectives. And, from a legal point of view, that's conceived as the perpetrator and the victim in certain circumstances if somebody becomes infected. Now, I don't agree with that particular categorization, but I just want to say that no matter what I say, I'm not suggesting that the circumstances in which somebody becomes infected is blameworthy, and there are a myriad of circumstances in which somebody can become infected, and people have can have many and wide-ranging feelings about those circumstances, and whatever I say isn't meant to disregard anyone's particular perspective, and that's the government health warning before we start, as they say. I'm presuming that for the purposes of this discussion that people don't have any legal training and don't have any background in the law, and if you have, you can critique me in due course. If you don't, well then you just have to believe what I tell you. I suppose I thought the best way to deal with this, and to let you have an opportunity, I can talk to you all about the harm of HIV infection, causation, phylogenetic analysis, recklessness, the mental elements of crimes, the physical elements of crimes, but there won't be that won't be hugely interesting to people. So I want to really, and I hope you're happy with this, tell you about how criminalisation has emerged internationally, looking principally at England and Wales briefly, Canada briefly, and the United States, because they provide three different methods of criminalisation, any one of which could be adopted in Ireland. And then to talk to you about currently how a person could be criminalised in Ireland, and perhaps then just briefly to share my own view on the appropriateness or otherwise of criminalisation, and I'd welcome your own views, given that I'm about to submit a PhD thesis in about 6 weeks' time. So if you have any great insight to offer me, I'll happily take it. But in England and Wales, if a person is infected with HIV arising from sexual intercourse, there have been a number of criminal prosecutions. It started with a case called Oran Dika, in the case of Dika. Now, Mr. Dika knew he was infected with HIV, and he had started on an appropriate course of antiretrovirals. He had been advised in relation to the appropriate safe sex techniques, and then had unprotected sex, and partners became infected, and then he was prosecuted. And he was the first ever successful prosecution. Now, there was a long-term precedent in law in England, and indeed in Ireland, called Oran, the case of Clarence, which said you couldn't be criminalised for the transmission of any sexually transmitted infection because it didn't involve an assault. Somebody had consented to the sexual intercourse. That was broken down in the Dika case and in a later case of Kunzani. So how is it prosecuted? It's prosecuted as what we call one of the assault-based offences, and it's known as grievous bodily harm in the United Kingdom, which carries with it obviously a very significant potential criminal sanction in the form of imprisonment. Interestingly, in Britain, they took the opportunity to say that if you do not disclose your HIV status to a partner and they become infected, it is not regarded, let's say that the court regards that as a deception. That deception doesn't vitiate or nullify the consent to sex. And that's very different to Canada, which we'll come back to in a moment. So what they've said is, if a person consents to sex and they didn't know that their partner was HIV positive, but their partner knew and they became infected, they still have consented to sex. But even if they consent to unprotected sex, they are not seen as consenting to running the risk of contracting HIV. Now, I think that's a very challenging proposition, and I have to say it's not one that I legally agree with. There are many, many consequences of unprotected sex, and the decision of the court in Dika and in Kunzani runs absolutely contrary to every public health message, which is that safe sex and sexual health is a shared responsibility, and that everyone must take responsibility for their sexual health. I think there are margins. I wouldn't have time to go into all of them. There are some times where one, for instance, might be in a situation. You can look at two different sets of circumstances. You can look at somebody you meet on Grindr or Tinder or whatever else, at somebody you meet in the club and go home with, or you can then look at a situation where you're in a long-term committed relationship where you have an expectation arising out of your shared discussion of monogamy, and then somebody cheats on you and then they become infected and you become infected. There are two different, they're on a spectrum there, but the court doesn't recognise any spectrum. They say that all the responsibility lies with the person who has HIV to disclose their HIV status. If they don't do so, then the other party doesn't have knowledge. If they don't have knowledge, they can't consent, and they must consent not only to having the sex, be it even unprotected, they must additionally consent to the risk of contracting the particular disease, be it HIV or others. Now, there's another difficulty which arises on that front, which is what type of knowledge does the person who's infected with HIV have to have? Do they have to have had a positive test for HIV? The court has been finally determined, but in England and Wales, ultimately they've said it's vexed. Depends which person reads the judgment. But on the broadest reading of it, it's if you knew you had HIV, which would be as a result of a positive test, or if you knew that there was a risk that you were infected with HIV, which creates a problem then, because then you're starting to say, well, who will we say is at risk of having HIV? Well, gay men, of course, people who are prostituted, and you turn into this, you get into a very exceptionalist category, which America, for instance, has got into. Are you black? Are you on the down low? Are you a drug user? And you get into the courts criminalising categories of people, so that's a dangerous situation. But as it happens anyway, none of the cases which have emerged have actually been people who haven't had a positive test in England and Wales. They've all had a positive test. So But that is a troubling situation. The question then becomes, what type of knowledge does the person who becomes infected, who wasn't infected heretofore, do they have to have? Do you have to sit down and negotiate sex like a contract and sit down and say, well, now we've just arrived home from the club and we've all had a good night. Now tell us, let's talk about HIV before we begin. Now, whatever one's experience of sex after the clubs in town, it isn't normally like that, not in my experience anyway, when I used to be allowed to go to them. But the situation is not that simple. But interesting things, if you use apps, for instance, if somebody sees on an app, pause, is that sufficient? Not finally determined, but it's a question that that will be out there. If you're on Grindr or Tinder or whatever else it is, and you have a description of yourself, and it says pause, is that sufficient knowledge to put the other person on notice so that they have sufficient knowledge if they consent to unprotected sex? And I know it would be nice for me to be able to sit here and tell you that yes, it does. I can't tell you that it does. I can certainly tell you, if I was defending you, God forbid if anyone was prosecuted, that it puts you in a stronger position because you've put it out there clearly that you are, and you'd certainly be on the road then to having transmitted sufficient knowledge to the other person so that they can make an informed decision. The harm then of the offence is a result offence in England and Wales, which means that it's what happens after the offence. The infliction is the transmission. What's the aftermath? Well, it's called grievous bodily harm. That's highly contentious now, of course, as well. It's contentious because you can be prosecuted after you transmit the virus, but is there grievous bodily harm after you transmit the virus? The reality is there isn't grievous bodily harm. I'm not a physician, and you're all, I'm sure, much more familiar with the progress of HIV and how it in your body over years, but it isn't immediately grievous. And what's more, research would tell us now that in many cases a person who in a sense looks after themselves and is taking the appropriate antiretrovirals can have the same life expectancy as anyone else. So is that grievous bodily harm? And I would have a serious question as to whether it is a physical harm. I think there can be a psychological harm, and that can be a criminal offence as well, but it isn't normally grievous bodily harm. So that's how England has approached it, and I think England and Wales has much to tell us because we have similar offences to them, and you'll see when I come back later on to tell you about how I think the matter might be approached in Ireland. Although we have a separate statutory offence in Ireland, it is all based on our shared history, and our criminal law has plodded along in fairly similar paths over the years. If we look at Canada, Canada is an unusual set of circumstances. Canada, up until 1985, and I think that year is significant, had an offence on its statute book of transmission of what was then called a venereal disease, and it was what we would call a misdemeanour offence, a low-level offence, very small term of imprisonment possibly, or certainly a fine more likely. But then they removed it in 1985 from their statute book on the basis that criminalisation interfered with public health initiatives, and as a result such matters should be dealt with as public health matters, and consequently criminal sanctions were contrary to public policy or not in the best interest of the population. But then we had a case called Orr and Courier, and Mr. Courier had been diagnosed with HIV, had been advised by a public health nurse, different system there, to use appropriate protection during sex, to inform partners, etc. He didn't. His partner did not become infected with HIV, but when his partner found out that he had HIV, then a complaint was made to the authorities, and effectively Mr. Courier was convicted of rape. In Canada, I wouldn't propose to take you tortuously through the different legal theory of it, but basically, as I said to you, in England and Wales, they said if you consent to sex, the consent to sex is different to consent to running the risk of infection with a disease. Okay? In Canada, they said that if you are not informed of that the other person has HIV and they expose you to the risk, to significant risk of endangerment of your life, and they said that infection with HIV was significant risk of endangerment of your life, then the consent to sex, in legal terms we'd say, is vitiated or nullified. It's a fraud, which the law regards it, which renders nugatory the consent which was given. And essentially then, It's a form of aggravated assault in Canada. There is no offence of rape in Canada anymore. It's unusual in that regard. They reformed their criminal code. But the closest comparator we would have to that type of aggravated assault is actually that it would amount to a rape. And it is possible that Ireland, and there are broad similarities, by the way, in all the other theoretical points about knowledge, levels of knowledge, how do you communicate the knowledge, do you negotiate it, what type of knowledge does the person who was originally infected need to have versus the person who becomes infected or is exposed to the risk. All of those points remain the same no matter which country you're in and what legal theory you're operating in. But essentially the big difference between England and Wales and Canada is that in England and Wales you are not regarded as having raped somebody. In Canada you are. Now that's a very significant, from a public perception point of view, that's a very significant, to my mind, problem, because if you pick that path, you're actually even, rape is regarded as the ultimate utilitarian crime in legal theory, I suppose, or in common parlance. It's using a person for nothing other than your own gratification, and it's seen as even more heinous than assaulting somebody grievously, etc. And there's a problem with that, and I think that the way the Canadians have approached it mistakes the wrong of rape, to be honest. I don't think it's appropriate for this context. I certainly don't think that it has any place. Now, interestingly though, in Canada, where Canada has perhaps had a slightly more advanced approach, is that Canada recognises a defence of, in relation to, and you'll all be more familiar with this perhaps than me, but in relation to your viral count, okay? And if it's undetectable, the statistical probability of being able to transmit the virus is beyond negligible. In fact, it becomes statistically improbable that the virus will be transmitted, as a result of which, because these offences are based on a mental state on the part of the person who either passes the virus or creates the risk of passing the virus, it's based on recklessness. It's the taking of a foreseen risk which is regarded by society as unjustifiable. So I foresee that I'm running the risk of infecting somebody else, and society says that I shouldn't do that. But is it an unjustifiable risk if there's a statistical improbability of transmitting the disease? And in Canada has recognised that that is not, that is an effective defence. So that's good in the sense, because it accords as well with current medical advice as well. Okay. So moving away from Canada then, we go to look at the United States. It's the worst of all places in this sense. The Ryan White AIDS Care Act, I forget the year now, was introduced in the United States following the Presidential Commission. Ronald Reagan set up a Presidential Commission in relation to, what's called it? Well, it wasn't called AIDS then, it was GRID at that time, and then the names moved on but over time. As part of the outcome of that, the Presidential Commission actually took a fairly good view on criminalisation and said it should only be a last level intervention in this area of society, and that everything should be based on a public health approach, except when you get to the stage where somebody presents a significant risk to public safety, etc., and will not, in effect, mend their ways or habits. Woe that the states didn't listen, because it said in the Ryan White AIDS Care Act that in return for federal funding for treatment, you had to have a criminal statute on your books to deal with this issue. Now, a small number of states did the right thing. They said, well, since in World War II, America introduced statutes regarding crime, minor misdemeanors, they call them crimes, to deal with people who are prostituted, who were spreading disease among the troops. And I'm not being salacious, that's exactly what it was designed to do. And every state has it. Indeed, Ireland has a misdemeanor crime regarding people who won't cooperate with public health initiatives to prevent the spread of disease, yes? And some of them said, well, we have these, we don't need anything else. And they got their federal funding and there was no problem. But as I'm sure you know, different states have different philosophical positions in the United States. And then we got into some of the worst possible scenarios, which the UN and everyone recognises are terrible, which is HIV exceptionalist statutes. Statutes would make it a specific offence to transmit HIV. I won't go into all the different ways that they do it. They're terribly wrong. The reason they're wrong is that they increase stigma. additionally, why they are wrong is that every time that somebody is prosecuted successfully under a HIV exception in a statute, which involves, we'll say, if you had a risk register, let's say you say that certain conduct in society is a 5 on the risk register, some of it's a 7. Well, let's say the conduct that a person is convicted of reaches the 5, and somebody driving down the wrong way down the motorway, off their head on drink or whatever else, might be a 7. You can be sure that the person convicted of transmitting HIV at a 5 will get a higher sentence than the person driving the wrong way down the motorway. And it's just, that's what the data shows you because of the exceptionalism, because of the stigma associated with it. Also, many of these statutes have been inappropriately worded. They have criminalised conduct which doesn't carry a risk of transmitting the virus, which means in turn that they've perpetuated stigma within society, which affects people with HIV and the lives that people with HIV live and how people without HIV interact with people with HIV. The most present example of that is spitting. And there's a great statistic, I just can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a great statistic from the CDC about the number of gallons of saliva that you would have to bathe in order, belonging to a person who was infected with HIV, in order to perhaps, possibly contract the HIV virus. Yet there are many people in prison in the United States, or who have been sent to prison in the United States, we'll say, who are in a correctional facility or spat at a policeman or something like that. And they create bad messages. In addition, a number of the statutes didn't allow a defence of condom use. So what's the point of that? We said, sure, I'll just live a sexless life. Yeah, because that's realistic, because that's the way people, it's been so successful in life when we criminalise sexual conduct over the years. It's worked so well. Everyone stopped having gay sex when it was illegal, of course. Nobody did it. You know, we don't really learn from these mistakes. But that's, a number of those statutes are being changed. But the main problems are stigmatisation, increased sentences when risk is compared, or if for comparable risk situations, and acting contrary to public health advice, which denudes the effectiveness not only of testing and contact tracing. Like, testing and contact tracing are the two most effective ways of controlling an epidemic, and the intervention of the criminal law, particularly in those ways, significantly interferes with that dynamic. The other way that the United States has approached it is what they call aggravating statutes, so that you get prosecuted under a law like, for instance, grievous bodily harm in the United Kingdom, but you get an extra sentence because it involves HIV. So a person who had beaten somebody would get a year, a person who had exposed another person to the risk or had transmitted HIV would get 5 years. And that's the way the United States have dealt with it. Not acceptable, creates an exceptionist environment, and is universally condemned across the world, except by a very small number of writers in the United States who see it as appropriate. So that's what's happening across the world. Variations on a theme occur in other countries. The reason I picked those countries is they kind of provide an example of each type, and they're common law jurisdictions like us. They operate under a constitutional scheme. You can go to civil law countries, they have similar statutes. How might Ireland, or what is the situation in Ireland? There has never, I'm sure all of you know, there has never been a prosecution in Ireland for either exposing somebody to the risk of HIV or transmitting HIV during sexual intercourse. It's important to recognise that the statute book, as we call it, the laws in place, have recognised a scenario before about the risk of the transmission of HIV or other blood-borne diseases. And we did that in 1997 when we introduced the Non-Fatal Offences Against the Person Act. Because if you remember, prior to that, there was a moral panic, as we call it, around heroin use and people being threatened with syringes, etc. So we created a bank of specialist syringe offences, which, by the way, were absolutely and totally unnecessary. There was nothing in any of those offences that can't be prosecuted in another way. But the best way to solve the problem is to pass law. So what we did was pass laws related to syringes. But there's a specific, the point I'm making is, you can see the contempt with which I view some of these things, but the specific offence within the syringe bank of offences is relating to threatening somebody or spraying somebody with a contaminated fluid or what could be a contaminated fluid. So there is the point I'm making is there's already a conception in the mind of the law of the state of an offence potentially involving infecting another person, okay? But it doesn't obviously involve sexual intercourse, and it would be regarded as presumably, the more classical criminal situation where you threaten somebody or spray them with something or inject them with something. It's not normal day-to-day life, which includes sexual intercourse. So if there has never been a prosecution, I hope there won't be. My entire thesis is that in virtually all circumstances, bar one or two that I can identify, the criminal law does more harm than good. The only thing it does is satisfy a sense of necessity for what's called justice and or also known as vengeance on the part of an individual. And that is, by the way, a philosophical justification for criminalisation of conduct anyway. But my view is that you have to take into account the wider societal situation. And it's my genuine view that there are people who do not behave appropriately in the management of themselves and their relationship with others. And you have to ask yourself, how do you manage that behaviour if it's not something that society sees as acceptable, which doesn't in turn cause a HIV or hepatitis or whatever it is exceptionalist situation. In Ireland, if a prosecution were, and I'll come back to how I think we should do that, which will be somewhat challenging, I think, what I'm going to propose. But where Ireland is likely to go, it is possible that it could be prosecuted as a poisoning offence. It will be, I think it will be a bit of a stretch of the imagination, but there's no reason in law that you couldn't do that. And in some countries it has happened. It's much more likely to be dealt with what we call a Section 3 assault, which is an assault on a person causing harm, or a Section 4 causing harm offence, which is the equivalent of the GBH offence. And it's either temporary or permanent disablement of parts of the body. So I presume the way we'd stretch that out is we'd look at the immune system and look at that as a part of the body and look at the effect of the virus on the immune system and how that would be comprehended by the law. Bad and all as it was in England and Wales when such a prosecution was brought, what happens is the media latch onto these prosecutions in a particularly virulent, if you excuse the expression, manner. And people are characterised in particular ways. In the United States, the evidence tells, and the United Kingdom to an extent, if it's a woman who infects a man, she's regarded as some sort of siren temptress who's drawn this poor individual into her web and is portrayed in that type of way. And that's what the literature tells us about how this happens. If it's a man infecting a woman, particularly if it's a man of colour, they're treated extremely badly, and particularly if it's a man of colour and a Caucasian woman, it's then, this poor white woman has been treated so badly. And this is what the patterns that emerge. Now, you might think about, well, what about a man who infects a man or exposes a man to the infection? Actually, there are very few cases where complainants arise from same-sex partnerships. It is only my estimation, and some others share it from the readings I do, that perhaps in a same-sex relationship there would seem to be, I won't say an acceptance is wrong, but a sense of responsibility that if I have chosen to have unprotected sex, I have taken the risk and I must take the responsibility for the risk. It would seem to be, and I can only tell you, I can't leap into the minds of everyone who's ever had this happen to them, or anyone even, but it would seem from the way prosecutions have emerged that it's more likely to be in that scenario. So that's likely how we proceed. What would have to be shown? It would have to be shown that the other person essentially didn't know that you were HIV positive. Your only defence, really, is to show that the other person knew. Now, you get into a problem, don't you? I'm sure you can immediately see what the problem is. You're going out with somebody. There isn't there's fetishes around the virus. Then there are people who are just not too bothered. I'm not going to, you know all this yourselves. And let's say you go home and you have a discussion. You do. And it takes bravery to do that because there's fear of violence, there's fear of rejection, and things. I'm more speaking from what friends tell me and what I read, but I'm sure you know yourselves. But let's say you're brave enough to do that and you do it and you have that conversation and the person says, yeah, I don't mind. Right, we'll have sex. Perhaps your viral count is very low, but not undetectable. They're willing to take the chance, whatever the scenario is. You're out for another 4 weeks. You know the way you're in mad, lustful love for the first few weeks, and then you realise they're just horrendous people and it all breaks up, and etc., etc. But then what happens is, what if a person says, you didn't tell me? And you get into the he said, she said. And the reality is, and there's two, brings me to an additional problem, and that comes from both, if you talk about it, and I'm just going to use the term from a legal perspective now, let's say you had a person who wasn't infected, became infected, and a person who was infected, who infected the other person. You get into the victim-perpetrator mode. The problem is, for years and years, particularly female victims in Irish courts and in courts across the world, have had, every time they allege a sexual crime having been committed against them, to have their sexual history poured across in intimate detail. Now, there are statutory limitations to that now, where you have to get the permission of the judge. But I can't see a judge in Ireland rejecting, let's say I'm defending one of you, rejecting my application to say you can't cross-examine that woman and or man on their previous sexual history. Why? Because there's actually no scientific way to show that one person infected another person with the virus. The phylogenetic testing which is available can tell you if you have a similar strain, but as the virus mutates within the body, you can never get a definitive answer. So it is all based on the circumstantial evidence. So if you have somebody who says, I wasn't infected and then I became infected, you're relying on their word to say that they were monogamous, etc. So any good defender of a person is going to say what? Which now weren't you seen in the George or in somewhere else, or you were seen in Dakota, or, and you're going to start saying those, and that becomes, and I think that's really difficult for somebody who's in the space where they have made a complaint and feel violated and feel that it was wrong, that they were infected with HIV, that their bodily integrity was violated, that their autonomy was violated by not being given the choice to consent or not to consent. And they're the things that people who have become infected often say in the literature. And then, by contrast then, for the perpetrator as well, there's an extensive canvassing of their sexual history and who have you told your last partner, did you tell the partner before that type of thing. So we end up in that difficult situation. So your only defence really is that somebody knows, but I regrettably have to tell you that when the criminal law is involved, as I tell my students, if two fellas are walking down a road and there's no cameras, no lights and no witnesses, and one fella hits the other fella, does it mean he can't be prosecuted because there's no witnesses? What if I say he fell on the ground, he says I hit him? Which of the court will still prosecute you once there's somebody there to say that there's evidence. But we then get into the situation of having to trawl through people's sexual history, etc. And it isn't a dignified process, and it's unavoidable in these circumstances because people are entitled to make a complaint. Crimes aren't prosecuted on behalf of victims, they're prosecuted on behalf of society because we've had to move away from the feud situation. But then alleged perpetrators are entitled to a defence and they have constitutional rights as well, so you get into a difficult situation. So that's where we're at, or where we could go. Knowledge, the imparting of knowledge, and I don't know, what do? You send a text message? I don't know, it seems silly the way I say it, but you do get into a difficult situation where, and it has arisen where people have, and of course for sure it's like, you cannot believe every person, you cannot disbelieve every person who says they have been the victim of a sexual crime, yet at the same time you cannot automatically believe everyone. There's a charge, there's a defence, there's a prosecution, there's a defence, and then there's a verdict, and you rely on the verdict the best you can do. But within that situation, I suppose I'm trying to say to you, the only way you're going to be able to mount any sort of reasonable defence is to be able to say that you told the other person, and to be able, if there was somebody else present, I don't know what you do. Are you having a discussion? You can get into more vexed scenarios and was that correspondence lying around, all that type of stuff. What's the alternative then to the intervention of the criminal law? Well, we have public law, public health law in this country and in every country to deal with the spread of disease. I do believe it is not an acceptable social practice, and it is not for the good of society as a whole, for a person who has the potential to spread a disease which could be life-threatening, would always be life-threatening, and may well only be regarded as life-limiting, or may not be regarded as life-limiting, might only be regarded as symptomatic, but not life-limiting, covering a wide range of scenarios. But let's get the worst of it out of the way. Let's say you are a person who has a strain of the virus which unfortunately is somewhat drug-resistant or is becoming drug-resistant, something like that, which is a problem we have in, let's say, HIV, but gonorrhea, syphilis, stuff like that. You're given advice to persistently use condoms, you refuse etc., etc., etc. What do you do? Well, what would we do if somebody arrived in Ireland that had multi-drug resistant TB and refused to stay in their home until their treatment? Does anyone know what we would do? Yeah, we would quarantine them. But please don't think me, I'm not suggesting we set up encampments for people with HIV here, there, and everywhere. But I am aware, and I know from the discussion with, that there's a big difference between, there are people who consent to take the risk of being infected with HIV. I have no problem with that. That's a person's own choice. I'm a libertarian in that regard. I don't have an issue with it. And the British courts don't have an issue with it either. Then there are people who perhaps should take appropriate protections but don't take appropriate protections and refuse to do so on a consistent basis. And physicians would tell me that in certain circles, in certain situations, and you might be aware of this yourself, please don't think me rude when I use this phrase, I don't mean to do it, I genuinely don't, but the doctors sometimes call it a super infector, somebody who has, it would be presumed, infected a large number of people, and in circumstances where there wasn't this consensual circumstance. And I do think that there is a space for involuntary civil detention in those circumstances, because, and the reason I have to say that to you is, like, I'm highly, and I hope it's evident, like, I'm highly supportive of people with HIV and their absolute right to live a life free and unencumbered, safely sent and encumbered in person, not society encumbered by the fact that they're infected with the virus. But I have to tell you, the reality is, unless you have some method of dealing with persons who society regards as failing or being unwilling to take appropriate protections, you are going to end up with criminalization. based on a realistic prospect of getting the disease, and spitting isn't one of them. But it's been a long since, now not so much in Ireland, but in other cases, in other countries as well, and people can be playing on being ignorant when they're not really, you know. But you would hope, like I can't tell you that Ireland could not prosecute somebody for spitting. There's no specific law, but it would be, I would like to think that we're advanced enough here that scientific evidence would be presented and the judge would be like, ah, look, come back to me when you have a real case, you know.
Obviously, I don't want it to become a criminal offence, but if it did, are we better at the moment to prosecute under oath and to acquitted laws, I take it? So are we not better, on one hand, looking at new statutory
Specific offence, yeah.
laws now, rather than letting this happen on the poison laws or whatever?
Yeah, the question is, if we were facing into a criminalisation scenario, would we not be better to have a specific offence rather than a general offence? The answer in my view is no, because the specific offence creates HIV exceptionalism. If you can be prosecuted, like my whole view, I have to tell you the whole thing, none of this has got to do, in my view, really with the spread of a disease. I have to tell you the truth. I think it's about sex, and it's about bodily violation and a sense of autonomy and a sense of immunological boundedness that's broken and a sense of betrayal. I think that's what it's really about. I'm not saying that that's not a justification for people feeling very badly hurt arising from being infected, but I just don't think it's the same as saying I got hit with a hammer on my leg and my leg was broken, because it just doesn't make sense. It's not the same. But the point is, if you introduce a specific offence, you think, and I'm being respectful in saying this back to you, you would be perfectly forgiven thinking it was logical to say you could legislate for the best of all circumstances and wrap it all up. The problem is we have examples of an entire state, an entire country which did that and has made a hymns of it. And it actually makes the situation worse, not better. And the reason it does that is that it creates an exceptional scenario. And if I'm going to be, if we say that you can be prosecuted for spreading a disease, why should it just be HIV?
Oh yeah, no, I would agree.
Or you know, hepatitis. Why should it not be TB? If I get on a plane knowing I have multi-drug resistant TB, why shouldn't I be prosecuted? No one has ever been, by the way. But why shouldn't I be? I know I'm getting into an enclosed environment with recirculating air and I have the risk of infecting thousands of people. And when I say that to my colleagues, at least it's kind of a vexed argument. Oh, well, it's different and all that. Hey, well, how is it different? Is it different because there wasn't a penis involved? Or, you know, and it does get into, and I'm not trying to be blunt, but I am trying to be blunt because you do get into that scenario of it. And I think it is about sex, really. And what by passing the law, you'd make it all about sex, I think. And actually, it's better under the general law, I think, to be honest. I don't think it should be under any law. My own view is if you were really pushed to have an offence, really, really pushed, it should be what we would call a summary offence, which is one that's dealt with in the district court, the same way as they had for those who are prostituted. Or the same way now, if you were in quarantine now, under civil detention, there's an offence of failing to peacefully submit to public health initiatives to protect the public safety. Something along those lines. If you're a recalcitrant, I won't say offender because it's not an offence, but if you're recalcitrant in terms of the safe sex advice that you've been given, you're not eliciting the consent of other people, perhaps society has an interest in saying, from a public health point of view, that there's an epidemic and that you can intervene that way. And the district court would be the maximum that I would think. But I think even then, once you cross the Rubicon, if you like, into criminalisation, becomes very difficult. Would you believe the vast weight of literature is against criminalisation? The vast weight of it. There's some headbangers who write, trenchantly on the issue. They're not headbangers, like they hold it, but they write trenchantly on it. Some of them are. But they write very trenchantly on the issue. But they're a very small number. The vast majority of people are anti-criminalisation.
Eddie, I think that was a fascinating talk. A quick question from a counselling point of view, because I do some counselling and I get asked this question quite a lot from people that might be undetectable and steadily undetectable. And they basically want to know, in a nutshell, should they be telling somebody that they're positive or not, when they're going over?
Yeah, the question is, in Ireland, if you're undetectable, should you be telling somebody? And my answer is to be safe, yes. Because, yes, Canada has recognised a defence of undetectable because of statistical improbability. But I would have to say to somebody that I'd be very interested to run that defence for somebody here in Ireland. But I wouldn't like to be the person on behalf of whom I was running that defence, because the great privilege of being a lawyer is that you'd be desperately empathetic with your client. You pack up your box and you move on to the next case. People don't, that's their life. And there is no principle in Irish law currently. So my answer is, if they want to be safe, and in the god-awful scenario where they did transmit the virus, and if there was a criminal prosecution, the only safe answer is that you've told. Now, you get into the situation then of personal, you see, it's all about risk, because the crimes are based on recklessness. It's based on foreseeing a risk and deciding to run the risk, and society regarding the risk as being unjustifiable. That's the mental state which is necessary to prosecute the crime. What you would argue in a person with an undetectable viral load is, I have been instructed that the scientific evidence is that it is scientifically improbable that I could transmit the virus. And I'm saying yes, absolutely, and I don't think that amounts to recklessness. I don't.
Is there a big distinction then between using a condom and not using a condom in an undetectable situation? So
yes, I think there's always, I think condoms, the use of a condom, I perhaps didn't say this clearly enough, the use of a condom in England and Wales is a defence. It is also a defence, it's a defence in England, even better in Canada. It's an element of the offence to say that you didn't use a condom. Now that's important, because being in England and Wales, when it's a defence, you're saying at first principles the action that you're doing is wrong. Sex, there's something wrong with the sex by this HIV positive person, but we'll render it okay or excusable by result of the use of the condom. In Canada, they say, like, there's pros and cons in both scenarios, obviously, because in Canada it's rape, but you don't want to be near it. But in Canada, they say you can only be regarded as having engaged in any wrongful behaviour by not using a condom. I would find it extremely difficult to understand how a prosecution could be mounted if a condom was used. So, if you used a condom, I think that there is a lesser duty to disclose. Yes.
So realistically, you could probably, if somebody was saying, I'm undetectable, and I always use condoms, and I don't want to disclose.
Well, I think that's okay, because I think it is a reasonable position, and I think it would be very hard. Like, I can't give cast iron guarantees. There's no cases in Ireland. I can only tell you what happens in 3 different countries. So it comes with that government health warning as well. But I suppose you're asking me as a lawyer, what do I think? And I think that it would be extremely difficult to mount a prosecution if a condom was used. Of course, then we get into one problem. What if the condom bursts? Get into a scenario then, don't we? Well, you expose me to a situation, and do you say, I think you'd have to stop, ultimately. I'm sure you don't have to go into the mechanics of the situation, but you'd have to stop, I think, or tell at that stage. But I think the singular message is, and it's in accordance with public health as well, if you're using a condom, you're doing the right thing, and the statistics support that it is improbable that the virus, it's not impossible, but it's highly improbable that the virus will be transmitted with condom use. Interesting question with oral sex, though, as well. That becomes a little bit more vexed. I don't know, do I have I'm sure you all know I have a table which amazes all of my colleagues with the different forms of sex, but I just can't see it here immediately. The different risks, receptive versus penetrative anal, same with oral. Sorry, here we are, yeah. So, like for oral intercourse, I find that perhaps even the most vexed. I find it perhaps the most vexed. Perhaps it's my own thinking, growing up in the city and the scene and all that type of stuff. And oral sex is always regarded as different, but there is a risk carried with oral sex, obviously, for the transmission of the virus. And I think as well, you would be getting into the situation where you'd have to be using a condom or disclosing.
Hey, so I understand what you're saying about the timeline of having HIV and phylogenetics behind the strain and not knowing who had the virus first. But I also know HIV is a non-communicable disease. But if a case was brought forward, a court order given to the local guy clinic to see if someone was infected, could that court order get that information from the local guy clinic?
I don't have a clear answer for that question. The question is, can you compulsorily acquire medical records, whether it's from a guide clinic, could be from your GP, could be from a private consultant, could be anyone, couldn't it, that you go to? It is possible, yes. And you see the problem then with criminalisation and testing. It drives people away from testing. It drives people away from contract tracing as well. Now, it's not as simple as a direct correlation. A lot of people, whether or not there's criminalisation, will want to be tested for the maintenance of their and improvement of their personal health. Because a lot of people will recognise, whether or not criminalisation is present, that if I go and get tested, I can know whether or not, and if I need treatment, access treatment, and hopefully live a life the same as everyone else, albeit inconvenienced to an extent. I don't mean to, taking treatment, etc. for the rest of your life. But yes, is the answer. I think they could. They do. Well, let me put it to you a different way. Could, if you were prosecuted if you were alleging insanity as a defence for nothing to do with this, could they compel the release of your medical records? They can. The relationship between physician and nurse and patient is a confidential relationship, but it is not a legally privileged relationship, right? And that's the distinction that people don't understand. If you're in a legally privileged relationship, such as lawyer and client, the court is not permitted to look into your communications. So when I talk to a client, the court can never release unless the client sues me, because then they waive their privilege. Okay? But the relationship between a doctor or a nurse and a patient is a confidential relationship. Confidential relationships are to be respected by the court, but the court conducts a public interest, what's called balancing exercise, to say where is the public interest best served in the maintenance of that confidentiality in this situation or in the violation of it. And a strong argument would be made by the DPP that this is a very significant matter. The public have a right to prosecute this type of high-risk behaviour, which is causing the continued propagation of an epidemic with the highest level of infections of late. And, I can write the script for them. That'll be the script. And he's standing up, there'll be a fella standing up there grabbing his gown, and he'll be saying it's terrible, the amount of people that are wantonly being infected around the place. That's what they'll be saying, because it's an easy scenario to make. Like, I have to tell you, my proposition is really hard to argue. I'm not, woe is me, I chose it. But, it's really hard and you have to be really rigid and forensic to construct the arguments to try and break down and to convince people that criminalisation isn't the way to go, because it's the easiest option. Public health, investment, education, contact tracing, free prophylactics, free testing, and at the ultimate extreme, and I'm talking about state-funded proper counselling, all that type of, that if somebody is problematic, they get intensive interventions. Not that they're given a slip to go down to the local mental health clinic to see the psychiatrist, who's, that's not what I'm talking about here, or the community mental health nurse, who's so overwhelmed dealing with people who are hallucinating down the street, that they can't properly engage. People who are able to properly engage with people who have who are infected with the virus and who may transmit it. To argue that those proper interventions should be in place, and then ultimately, if they fail, some sort of civil detention on a short-term basis to try and reorient people to the proper behaviour that's expected, is really difficult, because it's cheaper, it's quicker, and it's more publicly palatable to punish people. Retribution is always more palatable than prevention or rehabilitation. And retribution is the only philosophical justification for criminalisation. And it is a sufficient justification on its own to criminalise conduct. But to my mind, it carries too great of a social cost, and I can never, ever, since I first started studying this topic, which is in my 4th year now, I did a year before that, 5 years, I never have had anyone able to explain to me how we only ever started prosecuting people in the context of sex. I could never understand. At least the Americans were a little bit more honest now at the beginning. They had a blood problem as well. And when the Ryan White, because of the emerging virus and the machinery or science not being able to detect it, they had a different scenario. But I've never been able to understand how we just prosecute people in sex. And how we haven't done so given our obsession in the law with sex in Ireland, amazingly as well.
Thank you, Eddie. I've just got a question in on the wire, if you don't mind, which might be relevant to what you're just talking about. What are the issues around drug use and sharing injecting equipment? One of the issues being saying, could someone be prosecuted for lying about positive status?
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, then you could have that in the context of a sex scenario as well, if you're partying and stuff like that as well. Yes, is the answer. Yes, but I think that could happen anyway. I think, none of the heroin addicts in the city are making complaints that because they're not in a space where they're in with the law. They're trying to avoid the law because they're using an illicit drug. Yeah? But if you're in a situation where you inject yourself and then use the same rig to inject somebody else, and I think you're getting into a more classical, in my view, criminal scenario there, where you've injected somebody with a noxious substance. It's a different matter altogether. It's a very artificial act. Sex is a very natural act, in the broad sense of the term. But injecting somebody is an unnatural act in the sense of it. So I think, there would be a high risk, yes, very high risk of being prosecuted there if somebody was infected. Your only hope, perhaps, and I don't mean to be glib, but if you didn't laugh, you cry sometimes, perhaps the likelihood of them telling you, running to the Gardaí if they were injecting crystal meth the week beforehand is probably somewhat less, but certainly it could arise, yeah.
Thank you. Susie.
Just a quick question. What do I do if police knock on my door when I
Say nothing.
Say nothing.
The
This is a
standard
failure.
response.
I don't believe that actually blackmail. This is a failure.
So what do you say if you're approached by the Gardaí saying that somebody has alleged that you have infected them?
Said I won't be told to just say nothing.
I tell you now, it is sterling advice, if you're ever arrested for any matter, you say nothing until you've spoken to a solicitor. Okay? And you really, and I tell you, I obviously haven't the privilege of announcing or making recommendations for any particular criminal firm of solicitors in any room or on the internet. But can I just say to you that I'd be making sure that I would call a solicitor from a good criminal firm with an interest in the broader human rights of people who are accused of criminal offences. And what I mean by that is, and it's no criticism to my colleagues, but most of my colleagues would say to you, when I say what I'm studying, everyone loves what I'm studying when I talk to them because they're kind of a little bit of that's interesting. And what's it about really? And but what do they know about it? Nothing. And an awful lot of them would say, but it should be criminal. It should be a criminal offence. That's the standard response, actually, the stock response I get. And I have to start breaking down the arguments then. But I would say nothing. You're obliged to say nothing if you're approached by the Gardaí. Okay. If you're arrested for questioning, if you're called in for voluntary questioning, if a Garda comes, just so everyone understands, and God forbid that you are ever faced with this, if a Garda comes to talk to you in your house, you are under no obligation whatsoever to say anything to the Garda. Okay? If a Garda comes and arrests you and takes you to a Garda station, additionally, you're not under any obligation to say anything. The Garda must advise you when you arrive in the Garda station of your right to consult a solicitor. And now, actually, thankfully, we changed the constitutional law in a case called DPP Gormley and White only last year, that you have an absolute constitutional right to consult with a solicitor before any interrogation would begin. So let's say they decide to bite the bullet, so to speak, and we're going to go after somebody for Section 4 causing harm. Now that's a serious offence. That can carry a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Not suggesting people would be in prison for that length of time, but that's how serious it is. Because, you're everything, that covers all forms of harm up to killing somebody. So you can see my point, yeah? So you go to the station and you ask for a good criminal firm of solicitors, and you don't go to the local person who would never have any experience in this. you know. And my advice, you know, there is a very unfortunate situation in Ireland now where you can be given a special caution when you're questioned, that if you fail to mention something during your questioning which you later rely on in court in your defence, so you're asked in an interrogation to account for X, Y, or Z, and you say nothing, and you later arrive at trial and say A, B, and C in relation to those circumstances, that the court would be entitled to be told, or the jury would be entitled to be told, well, you were asked these questions now, and there's this principle that the law and order people have, crime control it's called. They say, well, sure, the innocent have nothing to fear from speaking. I've never heard such waffle in all my life. That's not how it works. But you'd have to get advice from a competent solicitor in this area who'd be able to advise you as to whether or not to say something in the event that you're asked that type of question. I don't want to make it overly complex for you. I'm not trying to. Just don't say anything and get proper legal advice. All right. Do you have another question?
Any other questions? Nothing else coming in on the wire?
Just in a sense of, I can imagine your PhD being influential and God, libertarian, sensible in the area of what kind of law we should have, if we should have any at all. But I think we should go by the Swedish model. I just think the whole idea of the detention, just educating, counselling. But is there any kind of figures on the rates of people who went through this detention, and if there's any even rates of recidivism of this negligent behaviour?
Well, there isn't proper. The question is there a comparative analysis between perhaps the criminalisation regime and recidivism? Does it have this reorienting effect to people? And in the alternative, does this public health detention, ultimately civil detention model, reorient you? I can tell you what criminalisation has done. It has observed an increase in the rates of infection. So the deterrence rationale just isn't working. And you all know how we negotiate sex. You know, it's not like a contract. It can be in committed relationships, it can be in clubs, it can be on apps, it can be in all range of sets of circumstances and places. And it's not as simple. You don't sit there and say, well, Jesus, I wonder will I be prosecuted? You know, it does come into your head, I'm sure, if you have it, but you know, I mean, in the spark of the moment, perhaps that's not your foremost thought, if you like. But in all countries where criminalisation is in operation, it has had no reducing effect. And the literature would suggest that it is preventing proper public health initiatives. There isn't cogent research on the effectiveness of the detention element, if you like, of the civil detention model, but there's plenty of evidence to show how testing, contact tracing, counselling, ongoing interaction, good healthcare, free, accessible, vertically and horizontally equitable, equity in availability, they all reduce transmission rates, and they are the only ways that we have ever in society. Like, you'd think you were reinventing the wheel dealing with an epidemic, really. You would think that we didn't have diseases that were so destructive, infectious diseases and communicable diseases, droplet communicable diseases, which killed people in short periods of time, and we never resorted to the law like this. It's really about managing risk. It's about the sense of, you know, self, and that's not, and I really, really stress this, it's not, in saying that I can feel it can appear very cruel to people who feel very violated when they were infected. Okay, that's not my point. My point is that everyone has a right to feel the way that they feel, everyone has a right to express how they feel, but we have to order our society on what's best for controlling the disease rather than dealing with individual feelings. And what we want to do, whether you're infected or not, presumably, is that we want to control the disease, which is to reduce its transmission levels, ultimately, hopefully, if scientific developments continue up to an extent where we will have people who are living out their lives, hopefully, relatively normally or totally normally, with the disease, and others perhaps not getting it if we manage to get a vaccine. Yeah. And we didn't talk about PEP or PrEP. PrEP, we never talked about PrEP. PrEP is
that's for the next lecture.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I don't really, haven't a few weeks now to get to grips with that before I finish my work. But
we'd love to have you back to talk about it when you're ready. Thank you very much.
Very good. All right. Thanks very much. That's That's great. Thanks to everyone at home as well. Thank you.
I just want to say thanks for this.
You want to just face me now?
I want to stage now. I just want to say thanks to everybody for tuning in online. Thank you very much, Edward, for your very informative talk. And thanks for everybody attending tonight. And the video will be, the recording of this video will be put up online at a later date. Thank you very much.
Yeah.